have to say goodbye to Carmen McRae and Sammy Davis Jr. for a bit. We'll play you out at the end with that too. So again, welcome. Thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Colleen Butler. I am the capacity building lead for Local Voices Network, which is housed at Cortico. And what that means is that I get to do lots of trainings, both internally at the organization and externally with our facilitators. So I'm really excited that you all decided to join us on the webinar here today. I'm going to start out by just kind of sharing with you all what's upcoming, and I'm also having some other team members from Local Voices Network introduce themselves, and then we will jump in. So today you are here for our Focusing on Personal Experience webinar. This webinar is the most like a traditional facilitator training that we have. So we'll be talking about facilitation tools and tips and strategies that you can use to help keep the conversations focused on people's personal experiences, stories, and narratives. Next week, T. Marie and I will be co-facilitating the Engaging with Discomfort webinar. This is our third conversation principle for Local Voices Network, and we'll go deeper into that. And basically it covers kind of two sides of this principle. One is engaging discomfort with yourself as a facilitator, kind of understanding what your hot buttons or triggers might be and figuring out some strategies on how to regulate those so that you can stay present as a facilitator and continue to hold the space even when somebody says something that you maybe don't agree with fairly strongly. And then we'll also be talking about conflict navigation in a group. So that's what we'll be doing next week. And then our final webinar, T. Marie is going to take the lead on that one. She is our lead for curation, and she will be talking about how we select highlights from conversations, what are some of the ways that you can kind of focus on particular things, and also how we can overcome our own biases to the degree possible when we are picking out highlights and curating conversations. So we're excited about those upcoming webinars. And then lastly, I wanted to let folks know, you probably got this in the email that I sent out as well, but we're also going to have a lunch and learn with a special guest the week following the end of our webinar series. The Lunch and Learn is with Herbert Wilkerson, and the topic is going to be called Being Trauma-Informed in an Uncertain Society, and that's on Thursday. So most of these webinars are on Friday, but that's going to be on Thursday, July 2nd from 11:30 to 1. So it's also a little bit longer, and I mean 11:30 to 1 Central Time, 12:30 to 2 Eastern Time. So we'll have some registration up and out for that shortly, and so please feel free to join us for that. We're really looking forward to learning from him and hearing more about, you know, in these times that are fairly tumultuous, what are some ways that we can continue to be mindful of the trauma that people who are coming to our conversations may be holding, people who we are communicating with may be holding. And then also ourselves as facilitators, we are listening to a lot of conversations that are really challenging. People are sharing a lot of things that are, you know, disturbing about their personal experiences. And so if we are empathetic people, it sometimes can be difficult for us as facilitators. So he's going to be kind of going through some of the strategies that we can use to be mindful of all that and also to take care of ourselves. So look forward to seeing those of you who can join us for that one there as well. And now I'd like to just quick turn it over to, I guess I'll start with T. Marie and then I'll go to you, Jess. I'd just love to have you all introduce yourselves, and T. Marie, also if there's anything you want to add about either of the webinars or the Lunch and Learn that I might have missed, please feel free to fill in the blanks for folks as well.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being on the webinar. I'm T. Marie King. I am the lead for Local Voices Network, Alabama, and excited about these conversations, but I'm really excited about the trauma-informed one. I think it's very important that we know how to process our way through tough times, and we're dealing with, you know, unrest in our society, but we're also dealing with that in the midst of a pandemic. So I think it's a great opportunity for you to, get tools that you can just incorporate in your own daily life and in the work that you're doing. So hopefully y'all will be able to join that session with Herbert. But glad to be here, enjoying doing the work and hearing the conversations, and glad that y'all engaging with us in this way. Thank you.
Thanks, T. Marie.
And hi, everyone. I'm Jess, and I am our LVN Massachusetts chapter manager. Thank you for being here with us.
Both T. Marie and Jess kind of downplayed their awesomeness. So I'm just going to say T. Marie is like a key player in the activist scene in Birmingham, Alabama. She's going to jump off this call to be on one of like 35 panels she's been on in the last 2 weeks. So really lucky to have her. And Jess is a superstar at LVN, really taking things all sorts of places in Boston. And I know some of you all who are on the call today are joining us from that chapter, so you know how great Jess is. And also she is a superstar in terms of helping us out with all of our tech today. So if you have any questions, you want to pop them in the chat. She's going to be monitoring the chat and making sure that I am attending to those questions as well. So thank you both for being here. And I'm going to go ahead and jump into our content for today. I will say at the beginning, I tend to be more of a facilitator than a presenter. So doing these webinars where there's not so much interaction isn't exactly what I love to do the very most. So if you do want to be kind of more interactive, either through the chat or through asking questions, I very much welcome that. We've tried to build in some opportunities for interaction as well throughout the webinar today. So looking forward to connecting with you all in that way. So I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about why we recommend The Danger of a Single Story as the kind of resource leading us into this conversation. I hope some of you had a chance to watch this TED Talk before our meeting today, but if not, definitely highly recommend it. It would be in the email that you got for registration for the session today. And in the TED Talk, she talks about the danger of a single story being basically that when she uses her own personal experience, both as an author and as somebody who came to the United States from Nigeria, and she talked about how her own perspectives have been shaped by the literature that she read early in her life. And then she also reflects on how the perspective of her roommate when she first moved to the US and came to college in the US, was kind of influenced by her ideas of what Africa was. And she found, she was quite surprised that her roommate spoke English and that she knew how to use a stove. And she uses all of these examples in her TED Talk. And really what she says is that when we only have a single story, and that story isn't actually informed by the people who the story is about, it fuels our stereotypes, it fuels our prejudices, it adds to the fact that we really don't understand each other. And so I really appreciate this TED Talk and her perspective, because she helps really lay out in a funny and personal way how understanding people's personal stories and narratives can give us a more nuanced and complex understanding of the world, and really works towards the LVN mission of increasing understanding across differences. And so highly recommend this resource if you want to kind of get a sense of why it is we are trying to build this collection of stories, and why your role as a facilitator is an invitation to help elicit people's personal stories. The other thing that she shares that's really relevant to what we do here at Local Voices Network is she talks about how when you understand someone's personal experience or their personal story, it's much more challenging to kind of argue with it, to take issue with it. When you're listening to a woman from Nigeria talk about her family and her experience, it's much more difficult to argue with that, because she's there telling you what her experience has been with her family. Whereas if you're kind of coming at it with just your own kind of preconceived notions about a community or about a particular group, you know, it's easier to get into a space of A, like not having particularly nuanced conversation, and B, actually fueling stereotypes rather than learning. And so many of you, I see in terms of who's on the call right now, a lot of you have been in one of our recent facilitator trainings. So you've had the opportunity to kind of go through the activity that we do, or maybe you got to see it role modeled by some of our staff, where we ask people to think of something that they believe in strongly. And then we ask a partner to kind of ask them first questions that are really intended to try to persuade that person out of their opinion. And then the second round, we ask people to ask questions to better understand. And when you get into that space of asking people to really understand their personal story, you both kind of offer those opportunities for connection across difference. You offer opportunities for greater nuance and understanding, but also you decrease the possibility for, you know, misunderstanding or argument or conflict that is not necessarily constructive conflict. So that's a little bit about kind of why this is one of our focus areas. And I just, you know, want to start off by talking about generally what is the role of the group facilitator. And before I jump into that, I'd like to just ask you all to, in the chat box, if you'd take a second and just make a note of what do you think the difference between a facilitator and a teacher is. So thanks, Jess, she just popped that question right in there. But what are some of the things that stand out to you in terms of a facilitator versus a teacher? And I'll give folks a minute to pop in there or get to your keyboards if you are listening for somewhere else. But really, this is kind of one of the key differences that we look at when we talk about the role of a group facilitator. So Regina says guidance versus instruction. So as a facilitator, you often are guiding a process, but you are not necessarily teaching a topic. So that's great. Thank you, Regina. Anybody else have anything you want to share in that chat box? Oh, Nancy, we've got something from you in here. Let's see. So listening and reflecting is kind of, I'm thinking is more on the facilitator side. The facilitator creates space for discussion, whereas teachers really are delivering content. So perfect. So you all have a pretty good handle on what we're talking about when we're talking about the role of a facilitator. But yes, and somebody says that they feel like teachers should facilitate too, but they're also responsible for providing answers if the students don't have the answers or the content awareness yet. So there's a balancing act there, and that's definitely true. And there are definitely times that facilitators have to move into a teacher role, but understanding kind of what the difference is really important, because one of the things that I've found, and most of my experience has been in facilitating conversations around racial justice and racial equity across difference. And a lot of times people feel like they have to know the answer before they can facilitate. They have to be an expert before they can facilitate. And, you know, that is a good way to never facilitate. So we really want people to feel like you don't have to be an expert or understand all the content before you are facilitating, in the same way that you would if you were an instructor or a teacher, where if you're a math teacher, you should definitely understand math. And if you are a facilitator, you know, you should understand how to facilitate, how to hold space for a group. But if you're a good facilitator, you should be able to facilitate a conversation about most topics. And really your role is creating a space where people can be vulnerable, people are listening, people feel like they can share from their experience, and ultimately you don't get put into the position of having to be the expert. And I can tell you lots of stories about how that plays out in racial justice conversations. So we'll see if we have time for that later on in our conversation today. But overall, you know, the role of the group facilitator is to make it easy to have the conversation. And so we really want you as a facilitator to feel comfortable providing non-directive leadership, almost like coaching. And you can see in this definition, we go right to what Regina first shared, which was this idea of guidance and kind of helping to navigate the conversation. We also are really wanting to create a safe environment for others to share their stories. I feel like safe and safety is one of those terms that is complicated. And so what I want to say that what I mean by that is we want everybody to feel like they can be vulnerable and share their perspective. There might be more bravery than safety involved in that. But as a facilitator, what our job is to make it feel like a space where anybody can share. And so that's what we mean by safety in this particular definition. Not that it's going to be comfortable, not that it's going to be easy, but that we as a facilitator aren't doing anything that would block somebody from feeling comfortable sharing their experiences. And then lastly, our last bullet here, this is going back to our mission. If you know me, you'll know that this is kind of always my focus. We always lead with the mission. And so as a LVN facilitator, our mission and your role is to foster conversation in communities that improve our understanding of one another. And so we do that by creating space and opportunities for people to share their personal stories. I know many of you are familiar with our conversation principles already, as this is kind of what we use to both guide this webinar series and also our facilitator trainings. I wanted to kind of share with you some other pieces in terms of the role of a facilitator in holding space for these principles. And so I think about the role of the facilitator as having two primary functions. One is content and one is process. In conversations, the facilitator doesn't have as much content delivery as you may if you were doing, say, a workshop where you were facilitating some content, but also holding space for small group discussions. But some of the ways that you may find yourself really working on the content side of things for LVN conversations is clarifying confusing statements. So if somebody says something and you think you understood it, but you can see that somebody else in the group or maybe a couple people in the group didn't understand it, one of the ways that you can jump in as a facilitator is to just make sure that you are bridging that gap. And so I'll talk a little bit more shortly about strategies you can use to do that. The other thing, this kind of connects with creating transitions in conversations. So you want to be able to identify common themes in the discussion and use that to kind of move the conversation along using the script or the guide that we have for the conversation process. Summarizing ideas, this is also helpful in terms of creating transitions in a conversation. And then expressing the direction or decisions that emerge from the group process. So, you know, this is a moment where you may kind of feel out the group and decide. So like one example of how I've seen this play out in LVN conversations is sometimes it feels really important to bring in a highlight from another conversation to get that perspective. Sometimes the conversation is so rich that it feels weird to interrupt and bring in other voices. And so as a facilitator, you're kind of reading the group and making that decision, and then you can kind of check in with the group and say, you know, I feel like we're really on a roll here right now. Normally this is where we might stop and bring in another voice, but I'm inclined to do this, you know, and kind of checking in with the group. And so helping make those decisions and making sure that what you are proposing is in fact aligned with what the group needs and wants at the moment. So those are some of the spaces where you might find content facilitation, LVN conversation. You're definitely going to be doing a lot of process facilitation as an LVN facilitator. So, you know, really following the basic kind of facilitator guide that you all are familiar with, and I'll share just a touch more about that shortly. Making sure that you are establishing and making sure that people are kind of complying with the conversation agreements or guidelines that you set at the beginning of a conversation. Following those LVN principles. And so the principles are here as a guide. We really do want to see all 4 of these principles in every LVN conversation. How they happen, what questions specifically we ask, those things can change. What words you use to ask the question, that can change. But we do want to make sure that all of our conversations are grounded in shared values, that they bring out people's personal stories, that we lean into discomfort when it arises, and that we have opportunities to connect across community. So as long as those 4 things are in your conversation, you're having an LVN conversation. So just kind of keep that in mind as a facilitator. And then one of the other process points is helping navigate conflict in the conversation. We'll talk more about that in our webinar next week. So those are some kind of basic overviews in terms of process and content. I'm not going to go through the details of our conversation script or guide, because I know that you all have fairly recently either used the script or been in a training where I've gone through the script in some detail. But I do just want to mention that the conversation guide is really the tool that we offer to help you elicit people's personal stories. And so everything that we have in our script and guide is intended to kind of help create a space where people are sharing from their personal experience. The other thing I want to kind of draw your attention to is that on the kind of purple side of this slide, this is how I think about our overview of a conversation. So as you know, our conversation guide is like 6 pages long. And so I like to kind of think about it in chunks, and there are chunks that you want to just make sure that you get to in every conversation. And again, like which questions we get to and how we frame them, that may shift, but we want to make sure that this is included in all the conversations. So we always welcome people. We always let people know what LVN is. We always read the consent process. That's the one piece that we have to do really word for word, although we are, I'm happy to announce, close to a process where people are going to be able to do that consent process as part of their registration. And so when that happens, we'll be able to remove that from the script, which I think will make for a more natural beginning of a conversation, but we're not quite there yet. So for the time being, we still have to fully read the consent process. We always lead with our conversation guidelines. And as you know, the way that we do that is we share our suggested guidelines, and then we ask people, do they have any questions? Do they have any comments? Is there anything they would want to add or change? It's important to get buy-in in that space. Guidelines don't really work if you just say, this is what we're agreeing to, and then move on. So you got to make sure everybody does, in fact, actually agree to it. And then we get into the heart of the conversation, you know, where we have people introduce themselves with their values, where we have the opportunity to build relationships through the story for starter question. We do always add that in. This is one of the places that really kind of contributes to that sharing from your personal experience or personal stories space. We do it on purpose. I think it throws people off sometimes that we start with a personal story before we go into your community concerns or your community appreciations. But we start with a personal story to kind of set the tone for the rest of the conversation. And that helps you as a facilitator kind of help people get some practice sharing from their own experience. And then we have the questions about what do you appreciate and what's working well, and then what concerns do you have. Then we do our kind of connection across community where we bring in highlights. And then we move into the closing of the conversation where people have an opportunity to raise their voices, and then the final logistics. So for me, when I'm thinking about the kind of flow or the kind of the structure of a conversation, these are the pieces that I'm trying to make sure that I'm kind of going in that order and not skipping. But as a facilitator, you do have the definitely kind of ability to make the choice to cut something out or make something shorter if it needs to, so that you can make sure that you spend the time on the part of the conversation that people are really kind of connected to. So what I want to do next is share with you one of our facilitators modeling what we are talking about in these conversations in terms of how we get people to share from their personal story or their personal experiences. And so this is one of our facilitators in Wisconsin. I'll share with you a little bit how he frames this for his conversations.
So first of all, and what I ask you to do as we talk about all these things is, to the degree you can, anchor them in a story from your experience rather than, oh, I heard all this out there from somewhere else. So what do you like most about living in Madison? What's the thing? If you were telling I really like Madison, and then is there a story in your life that explains why you like living here? Sure.
Russ again. I like Madison because of its diversity. Of course, and sometimes that's why I don't like the city, but we have to live to learn and grow with it. It's like the lakes. When I grew up, the only reason you couldn't see the bottom of the lake is because it was too deep. Mm-hmm. Now things have changed, but what they blame it on, I don't agree with. But it's, there's people, the way I hear people are blaming it on the farmers, but there was more farmers around here when I was a kid, and there's less problems with the lakes. Yeah. To me, it's what people are putting on their lawns, but that's a whole new story.
Sure. So when you talk about one of the things you value about Madison on the positive side of diversity, is there an experience you've had that says, oh, I'm so glad that we have this here?
The lakes?
So you get a sense of, the role of the facilitator when somebody kind of is potentially kind of going on a tangent, bringing it back to that personal story and having people kind of share from their personal experience. And I'll share another example with you all in a little while, but just wanted to kind of bring in some other facilitator voices to the conversation. So the next thing I want to do is just share some of the tools and techniques that we can use to try to elicit that personal experience from participants. So I know probably lots of you on the call have already done facilitation, and so they may or may not be familiar terms. So I won't go into a lot of detail. These are all also listed and articulated in the Facilitator Handbook, which we also sent a link to in advance of this webinar, and we'll send one afterwards as well. So all of these kind of definitions and descriptions are in there. But active listening as a facilitator is really what it sounds like. It means that, and it's trickier when you are on Zoom, which is why we always send an email beforehand for our conversations, asking people to have their video on. It allows me as a facilitator to see most of the people and be able to kind of get a sense of, are they checked in? Are they checking out? It's definitely different on Zoom than it is in person. In person, you have more kind of natural ability to make eye contact if that's appropriate. But on Zoom, you can still, you can nod, you can kind of give indicators, yes, someone should keep speaking, or you can try to give some nonverbals that in fact it's time to kind of wrap things up. And so your active listening is really just like fully being present and attending to whoever is speaking at a given time and giving them some cues that, that you're giving them your full attention. That's both a facilitation skill to get people to feel comfortable in your group, and it also is a skill in terms of modeling for other people in the group, the way in which you want them to be participating. I think one of the things that's trickiest about Zoom is that it's just so easy to multitask. And for these conversations where people are sharing their personal stories, it feels really important to have people give their full attention to the degree possible in this current moment to whoever's sharing their stories. This next one is pretty basic. It's just clarifying and rephrasing. So this kind of goes back to what I was mentioning earlier as we were talking about content and process facilitation. As a facilitator, one of your roles, sometimes I think about it as almost being a translator, like you're really trying to pay attention to what you think people are trying to say. And then if you can see that the message is being missed perhaps by another conversation participant or group, you can clarify a statement. And the way that looks is actually connected to this other concept called reflective listening. But basically that is where I would say back, if Jess said something to me and I could see that T. Marie was maybe confused or maybe, wasn't sure what Jess was talking about, I would say something like, Jess, what I heard you say was blank. Is that right? And then Jess has the opportunity to either say yes or no and to kind of continue to elaborate on what her meaning was. And that second part of like making sure you're right is really important. You might think that you understand what everyone in the group is trying to say, but you also may be potentially misinterpreting. And so you want to make sure, if you are trying to bridge that gap or be that translator, that you're checking in with the person for whom you're translating to make sure that in fact you are translating correctly. And so we call that reflective listening. Is basically reflecting back to people what you think they've said and making sure that you are interpreting it correctly and kind of providing that facilitation bridge. Monitoring and encouraging equitable participation is just what it sounds like. This is a balancing act. You usually will have some people in your group who really like to talk a lot and will be comfortable jumping in and sharing their perspectives. And you'll sometimes usually have at least one or two people in your group who are quieter and who are kind of reading the room and trying to figure out like what the norms are. That can be in a group in person and on Zoom. And I think on Zoom, many of us are still trying to figure out what those nonverbals are, of like, how do I jump in? How do I contribute? And so it becomes even more important as a facilitator to really be paying attention and making sure that everyone has a chance to speak, but also that we don't put anyone on the spot. So it doesn't look like me being like, T. Marie, I haven't heard you say anything. What do you think about that? It looks like, hey, T. Marie, I haven't seen you say anything yet. I just want to give you the opportunity to share if you haven't had a chance to jump in yet, right? So it's a different kind of framing, but you never want to put somebody on the spot because somebody may not have participated because they just don't have anything that they want to share in that space, and that's fine. So just kind of holding that tension as a facilitator, making sure everyone has a chance to speak, but also not putting folks on the spot if they are not participating very much. Timing, this is always a tricky one for, I think, most facilitators. I think our conversation guide is fairly well structured in terms of timing, but I'll definitely say that, you know, there are times in conversations where I spend a lot more time really focusing on the first chunk of the conversation, so the relationship building and really getting into like what's going well in your community, what are your concerns, and sometimes that means that by the end of the conversation, I don't have a lot of time for the raising your voices part. But we do want to encourage you to the degree possible to kind of stay to whatever time parameters you've given to your group. And so, you know, you can certainly check in and say, hey, this conversation seems like it's going really great. Do people want to stay on for an extra 30 minutes? That's totally fine. If people do want to or are able to, but if they aren't, you want to, as a facilitator, give people the opportunity to gracefully exit at the time that we had initially promised folks. And so, so yeah, just keep that in mind and know that you can condense the conversation questions if you need to. The one thing I will say is I do think it's important to have at least one closing question where everybody has a chance to respond. So I wouldn't skip all the closing questions, but if you need to narrow it down to one, that is okay. And then one of your roles is just creating transitions, figuring out the right moment to smoothly move from one section of the conversation guide to the next. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. Holding space for discomfort, which you know we'll be talking about it more in the webinar next week. But really for this one, just for purposes of today, what we mean is, you know, not feeling like you need to shy away from it as a facilitator when it feels constructive, and so making sure that you're creating a space where people feel like they can respectfully disagree with each other in the conversation. And we'll again talk more about what that looks like next week. And then stay present and beware of your own emotions, which actually is connected to that holding space for discomfort one as well. So, you know, I do find this to be more tricky on Zoom in that staring into a computer screen is just different than being in person and getting to see people's faces and body language. And so it, for me, I will say, you know, does offer a different kind of challenge in terms of presence. But for me, what that's meant is I've had to just be more intentional about creating the space, creating the time, setting some intentions for myself before the conversation so that when I'm there, I can really be fully focused on people and their stories. So these are just a couple of specific things that you can do to kind of help with that focusing on personal experience as a facilitator. You know, again, encouraging personal stories that are relevant to public or shared concerns, asking questions about impact. So this one is like, if you take that example that we heard before about that guy who was talking about the lakes and then diversity, you heard Phil, who was our facilitator in that conversation, basically say, how has that played out for you? You know, and you can say it as, you know, how's that played out for you? How has that played out for your family, your community? But, you know, as you're seeing people kind of divert into these larger stances, bringing it back to their personal experience, listening attentively. This one, I just want to elaborate on a little bit, using personal stories for a specific purpose. So I'm talking about you as a facilitator. So other people in the group, any personal stories they want to share is great, as long as it's aligned with the conversation. As a facilitator, your goal is to be the kind of guide for the conversation. And so when you are sharing your story, there should be a reason that you are moving from the role of facilitator to participant. So the reason may be you want to model for the group about how long you want people to take. The reason could be people are being really quiet and you feel like they need a model of somebody kind of being vulnerable to be able to be comfortable also participating. You know, so those are the kinds of reasons that you might feel like as a facilitator you could jump in as a participant. But in general, I will say, and this is one of the ones that I struggle with, or I struggled with a lot as a new facilitator, was I wanted to participate. I wanted to talk. I wanted to, like, I always get excited when I'm in these conversations. I just want to say things back to people. And so this was, for me, one of the areas that I had to focus on as a new facilitator, to really think, like, why am I talking right now? Am I talking because I just am excited and I want to participate, or am I talking because it has a purpose for the group? As a facilitator, that should be kind of your question in your head, like, am I doing this for the group or am I doing this for me? And if it's for you, you know, you want to shift it to being something that you're doing to actually help the group. And then understanding and showing openness to multiple perspectives. Asking questions to better understand perspective, showing respect, observing nonverbal communications to the degree possible on Zoom. One of the most interesting things that I've found is that, and I'm sure you all have too, because I'm sure you're all on a million Zoom calls just like I am, one of the new nonverbals for me is somebody unmutes themselves. I can see the little red microphone go away, and that's a nonverbal cue for me that they want to participate, that they're saying to me, like, I have a thing to say back to that. And so, you know, there are new ways that we are picking up on nonverbals. Guide the conversation back to focus if you feel like it's kind of going off track, or people are kind of going off on tangents. Recognizing and encouraging different forms of participation, including silence. And so I see that Jess has also put that into the chat box. But I think, again, on Zoom, this is one of the trickier things, in that we oftentimes want to fill up the silence or kind of fill in the blanks. And so I think just kind of making that space to make sure that people can process and respond is really important. This goes to what I was saying before, just making sure that people who want to speak have the chance, and be prepared and present for the conversation. So again, that goes to kind of, what do you need to do to fully show up in the conversation and be able to fully listen? These are some kind of flip sides. So the last slide were kind of specific things you can do to facilitate for personal experience. These are some things that can undermine that in a group. And so the main one is just forgetting the role of the facilitator. So acting or feeling like you are or have to be the expert. When I was doing racial justice conversations most frequently, one of the common detours that I experienced was that people would, in the group, ask the facilitators questions. So I would frequently co-facilitate we would have a multiracial team, and they would either turn it to me to speak on behalf of all white people, or to my co-facilitator to speak on behalf of whichever group that they were aligned with or part of that community. And what that does is it shifts from the people fully participating to both you as the facilitator feeling like you need to know the answers, but it also takes the responsibility off of and away from the group. And so I became really attuned to when I saw that happening in a group to just flip it right back right away. Like, oh, what do you think about that? You know, you just don't even, when people start asking you questions, you just turn it back around to the group. And then this goes with that as well. Just, you know, you don't want to try to represent an entire group or speak on behalf of others. And then this is probably the most common thing that facilitators get looped into, which is being in that instructional role of teaching or lecturing the group. And then another thing can be a challenge is losing track of time or getting sidetracked, doing too much of the talking yourself. Shifting gears without transition, or kind of putting somebody on the spot to force them to speak. So I just want to kind of take a moment here to ask you all, what do you think would be the hardest for you? And when you think of, oops, wrong poll. When you are thinking about kind of what, which would be challenging in terms of being in this space of facilitating for personal experience. And so I had a little poll, but it doesn't seem to be popping up for me, unfortunately. Let me see if oh, here we go. So I'm gonna put this out for you all to hopefully be able to see. So I kind of mentioned that for me, one of the things that was a challenge was talking too much or speaking too much without a purpose for the group. So that would be for me what I would put out as one of my bigger challenges. But for folks on the call, if you want to go ahead and put your answers in the poll, which ones kind of feel like it might be a challenge for you. And what I'd encourage you to do after we're done with the call today is kind of reflecting on that and having some self-awareness, then thinking about what can you do to kind of counteract that as a facilitator. So for me, like I have a tape in my head that's kind of like, stop talking, stop talking, stop talking. And one of the things that I can tell you with certainty is that when I have effectively gotten myself to stop talking or not talked to start off with, and I've told myself this will be better and it will come from the group, it always does. The group always gets to whatever it was that I wanted to say. And so for me, that's kind of like this, it's like a tape that's playing. So I think I'll give people like 5 more seconds on the poll if you want to jump in, and then I will close it out and share some of the responses. But looks like I'm the only one who has a problem talking too much. And then other folks we're seeing assuming the role of the teacher, losing track of time, not keeping the conversation aligned with its purpose, and feeling like you need to be an expert or know everything before beginning. So they're kind of spread out throughout the different ones. You know, one of the things I frequently, like I said, I frequently co-facilitate, and I'm pretty okay at keeping track of the time. And so oftentimes when I have a co-facilitator, we kind of like share that responsibility. So that's an option for you if you want to co-facilitate where you have one person who is really kind of focusing on the time management, and then you get to focus on, you know, the pieces that you feel like kind of allow you to bring your gifts to the conversation. So you can see a little bit of what folks said for this. And then I'm gonna share another clip from a conversation with you all. This one is, this is a tough one, and I want to kind of share before I press play that this facilitator basically did everything right. You know, she tried really hard to have this conversation redirect to this person's personal experience, and it was a struggle. And I just want to be clear that I'm not sharing this because the facilitator did anything wrong, but I am sharing it as an example of the way in which I've heard this come up in conversation. And I just want to have a little conversation with you all about like what would we do in a situation like this, with the caveat that this doesn't happen very much, but it's you know, every once in a while it does come up. And so I just want to give people a chance to think about what would we do in a moment like this in a conversation. So here you go.
Future of your communities or about
Kids are lazy.
Kids are lazy. So tell me more about that. What's a personal experience you've had, or
They don't want to work for anything. They just want everything given to them.
so how does what kind of you know, I guess interactions have you had that have kind of shaped your thinking on that?
Worked with younger people that just they don't want to work. They just want to show up, get paid, and go home.
What does it look like when they don't want to work? What kind of behaviors do you see?
Just laziness, just
Not looking for stuff to do.
They're not ambitious.
Not motivated.
Yeah, they just kind of stand around, and you have to physically tell them, or this is what you need to do.
Yeah.
Do this, and then you have to tell them when you're done with that. Do this. And when you're done with that, do this. They can't just think for themselves. Like, oh, when this is done, I'll do this, or I'll find something, or find someone to. I'm out of things to do.
So obviously that was a tough moment. I could tell she was trying so hard to get him to stop talking about other people in that way, and then also, you know, focus the conversation on his experience and the impact that it had. So just curious if you want to pop in the chat, like what other ideas do you have of things that you could do in that moment? Are there phrases that you might have used? Are there you know, what tools do you feel like you have in your toolbox that you might have been able to use in that moment, trying to redirect that conversation? Yeah, so Nancy just said, let's hear from someone else with another perspective, which is great. Any other thoughts, things that come up? Trying to get them to speak in specifics instead of generalities. Yeah, definitely. It was a tough example, but as I was looking for examples to share, I felt like it was a good one because the woman who is facilitating is actually, she's an excellent facilitator, and you know, so I knew that if she was struggling with it, it would be a good example, because she tried, I think, like 3 different redirect strategies, and none of them quite helped her get to the place we want to be. So so thanks for putting those responses in the chat. I'm going to share a couple of other things that we can do when we want to redirect. And again, everything that I am sharing is also in the handbook. So, so these are really concrete things that you can kind of have in your back pocket. So you can see that she actually, I think, pretty much tried this particular strategy, but you know, you can say, thank you for sharing that. Do you have a story about how that's playing out in your neighborhood or community? You've said a lot. What I'd like to do is take in what you've just shared and then reflect it back. In this particular situation, I don't think that that would be one that I would use. Did anyone notice what just happened here? This is more something that I would use when I was interrupting if there was kind of a miscommunication or some conflict happening in the group. And then this one might be one, this kind of goes along a little bit with what Nancy recommended. Before you go any further, how are you feeling, or how are others feeling about what was just shared? I don't know about you. I feel actually uncomfortable every time I listen to that conversation. And so I think creating a space where people who are uncomfortable in the conversation can express that is a kind of a helpful redirect and can take the conversation in a different direction. Similarly, you can say, I want to ask you a question before you go on any further. Have you noticed anyone's reaction to what you've said? This one is, obviously dependent on what people's reactions are in the group. You could hear in that group that there was at least one other man who was in full agreement with this particular thing. So this may or may not be effective depending on where people are in the group. This one is a good strategy for interrupting folks that are really monopolizing the conversation, but maybe in a constructive way. Maybe they're sharing something that's beautiful and powerful, but you can tell like other people just don't even know how to participate anymore. So this is a helpful one to kind of acknowledge that what people have shared has been appropriate and appreciated, but also to help move the conversation back to other people in the group. So before you go on to another story, can anyone else tell me one thing that he or she said that deeply moved you? This is obviously a little more directive, but if somebody's just really kind of talking a lot, just kind of giving them that directive of just take one more minute. And then lastly, and this is one that could have been used in that example, is I'd like to remind you of our ground rules. In our ground rules, we do talk about like speaking for yourself and not speaking about or for other people. And I would have personally felt very comfortable bringing that particular ground rule up in the conversation. So as a facilitator, and in that particular example, that would have been kind of my strategy, would have probably been to go to the ground rules after I had tried the first redirect. So I probably would have started with that first one of, do you have a story about how that's playing out for you, or what kind of impact has that had on you? And if that didn't work, I would go to the ground rules. And you have two options as a facilitator. One is you can be direct and say, I'd like to remind you of our ground rules. The other is, especially if you've got like a couple of people who are all kind of contributing, you can pause and just ask the whole group, how do you all think we are doing with our ground rules at this moment? Do we want to check in on that? So those are kind of two ways you can bring the ground rules in as a strategy to make sure that that you're aligning with your purpose. And then the last kind of bit of content I want to share, and then I'll hopefully have a couple minutes for questions at the end, is one final strategy that you can use as a facilitator that I find helpful. This is a strategy that was developed by a mentor of mine. Her name is Kathy Aubert, and you'll find her contact information at the bottom of the slide as well as in the materials. But just want to acknowledge that that is where this came from. So she talks about this strategy of PAIR, P-A-I-R. So the first is pan the environment and yourself. So as a facilitator, you're always kind of checking to see how people are doing in the group and how you are doing. If you're feeling flustered or defensive, you're not going to be able to hold the space for other people to participate in the way that we want them to. And so just kind of being aware both of yourself and of the group. A is ask questions to explore, and all of you know that this is a big thing for LVN. It's a great tool for any facilitator for any kind of process or project, but particularly for LVN, we really encourage you to feel comfortable using questions as your strategy to kind of keep things on track. Interrupt unproductive dynamics. So this is, if you're seeing or hearing things that you can tell are challenging other people in the group, not in good ways, or people are kind of taking the conversation. Like I know we have somebody on the call today from public health, and we're working with them to have conversations in their community that are going to impact kind of decisions that are being made in terms of public health responses in that community. If you have somebody who is in the conversation who's really talking a lot about like a particular person or a particular organization that they think is doing a terrible job, and as the facilitator, that's not actually the purpose of the conversation, right? The purpose of the conversation is to hear from people about their stories and their experiences. And so you don't want to have those unproductive detours where people are potentially kind of really being unkind or using it as a kind of platform or soapbox to call out or like other organizations or processes. So there's this balancing act of wanting to embrace conflict and have people share their experience with this tension of, but not to the point where the whole conversation becomes about kind of dogging out another institution or organization at the expense of hearing people's stories and experiences in the community. So there's this kind of tension there. And then lastly is relate in to others on their stories. And so as a facilitator, we have 90 minutes with folks. So if these are not people we know already and we're bringing together ourselves, we've got to build a certain sense of kind of trust quickly. And one of the ways that we can do this is by finding those points of connection where we can relate to people and their stories, where you can see them relating to each other and drawing attention to that. So I just find this particular strategy really helpful. So, always be attending to the environment, always asking questions, interrupting unproductive dynamics, and then relating in as like the 4 kind of components to facilitation. So I just want to offer that to you all as well. And as I mentioned, this was developed by Kathy Aubert. You can find, she's got like all of her resources online, so you can find out more stuff from her if you're interested. So I know that was a lot from me. It's kind of funny to hear me say that, we should not talk as much, and then I just talked to you for an hour. But if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and jump in or pop them in the chat. I do have like one final evaluation that I'd like to share with the group as well before you jump off. So if you don't have any questions and you're ready to leave, if you could just hang on for 1 sec so I can make sure that you have the opportunity to respond to the eval, which will take less than a minute, I'd appreciate it. But I do want to see if there's any questions at all that have come up that you haven't had a chance to put in the chat or I haven't had a chance to respond to yet. All right, well, I'm not seeing questions in the chat or hearing anybody. So I guess want to say that for me, I know I oftentimes think of my questions like hours after whatever training I've been to. And so if you do think of things, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, to Jess, to T. Marie, to whoever your LVN contact is. I'd be very happy to get back to you. And in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll, which is really serves as an evaluation for me in terms of these webinars and helping us to hopefully make some improvements as we go forward. So anybody, any feedback is very welcome, and I'll also be hanging out here. Jess is going to have to pop off in 1 sec, but I'll be here. So if you have any questions that we didn't get to, please don't hesitate to stay on and let me know. But if you don't have any questions, if you could help me out with the poll, I would appreciate it. And I hope to see many of you next week as well.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I have to hop off, but thank you, Colleen, and thanks everyone. And like Colleen said, I put our contact information in the chat, so feel free to email us any questions. Have a good weekend.
Jess. Thank you. All right, I'm going to play some music, and feel free to log off after.